Let's take a look at the step 4 bag. We're going to cut it open. Be careful not to cut any of the other bags open as you do this. Dump out the contents. Here, you'll notice your fins, or one of your fins. And everything has been, of course, separated piece by piece. Hardware, all the individual parts that go into the tail assembly. Be sure that you check any of the bolts on any of these parts that have been pre-assembled for Loctite. Let's cut these bags open and see what they do. In step 4-1 on this side of the page, you will notice you need to locate your vertical fin, the tail gearbox base, the tail gearbox side plates, there's 2 of those. You'll need the tail gearbox spacer, the control arm mount, the tail output shaft with gear. You will need 5 2x4mm socket cap screws, and you will need 2, or actually 3 2x6mm socket cap screws, and a 3x5x1mm spacer. That spacer actually goes on the outside of this gear. These 2 flange bearings are already here pressed into these side plates. To complete this assembly, just pay close attention to the direction everything goes. The raised surface of these plates actually faces outward on the gearbox when it's assembled. To complete the assembly, we will actually use a 1.5mm handled driver and blue Loctite. Let's look at all of this put together. After completing step 4-1, if you've paid close attention, this spacer right here goes on the outside of the gear right here between this and the bearing. After you get everything together, check it and make sure that there's no in and out play. This one's nice and smooth. If you'll notice, on this side of the gearbox, all the screws are 2x6mm. On this side of the gearbox, all the screws are 2x4mm. It was done that way basically on purpose. That way you knew which side all the hardware went on. So after you get done to this point, you're ready to put all the stuff on the tail output shaft. So let's see what that stuff looks like. In step 4-2 of the manual, on this side of the page, you will notice you need to locate 1 tail control arm, 1 carbon tail control arm plate, the tail slider assembly, which is factory assembled and uses no Loctite, so you will not need to take any of this apart. You can leave this the way that it is. It's ready to go. You'll need 1 control ball. You'll need 2 2x5mm flathead screws. These are very, very short and have a very flat head on them. They look like none of the rest of the hardware in the kit, so they should be easy to locate. You'll need 1 2x7mm flathead screw, 4 2x4mm socket cap screws, 1 plain M2 hex nut. You will need 2 2x5x2.3mm bearings. The other 2 bearings that you're looking for, these 2x5x2.5mm bearings, are pre-pressed into this arm, so you don't need to look for those. I'll show you a little trick here in just a minute to put these bearings onto this arm with these screws that makes it a lot easier to assemble this stuff. To do the assembly, we will be using a 1.5mm handled driver, a 0x0.5mm high-quality Phillips screwdriver, a 4mm box end wrench, and blue Loctite on all the screws. These are all going into metal, so you will need Loctite on all of these screws. Let's put this together and I'll show you a little trick here in just a second. When you get to this point of the assembly, after you've put a little Loctite on the end of your screw, usually I'll put the screw through the bearing and then apply my Loctite. That way I don't get a bunch of Loctite all over the bearing. Just hold it in your fingers and then slide it in between the fork and then just thread the screw in with your fingers. Once you do this, you'll find that you can just turn it all the way down most of the way with your fingers, just like this. That way you're not fighting it with a tool. And once you get it almost all the way down to the bearing, you'll find that you can take the screwdriver now and just turn it all the way down, all the way until it's flush. It sits very flat inside the bearing, so you should have no problem getting access to tighten it down. Give it a nice little snugging, and there you go. You're ready to go. Do the next one, you're ready to go. After completing all the steps in step 4-2 of the manual, if you've paid close attention to the direction of the arms and where these bearings actually are located, which is on the inside of this actual pitchfork right here, and you've paid close attention to the side that the ball goes on, this is basically exactly what you should have in your hand. And all you're really going to do is you're going to take your tail pitch slider assembly and just slide it over the shaft like this and meet the bearings in the middle and just pull it down. Now your slider assembly is actually on the shaft. You can actually apply a light oil to this so that it has a real nice smooth movement. Now let's get on to putting the rest of this tail together. As a team tip, we noticed that the tail output shafts on the first 10 kits were just slightly too long. I suggest you take a file and just file this down just a little bit about a ½ millimeter more in that direction. And when you mount the tail hub onto this, just slide it as far forward as you can. You only want about a ½ millimeter extra. I may have gone a little bit too much. I'll just basically gauge that. It was just slightly too long, which made the tail push rod in some applications a little bit too short. Also, on some of the gearboxes, there was a slight amount of in and out play on the shaft when they were put together, and all we basically did was take a cross shaft spacer that's used in the rotor head, and then all you have to do is really just shave it down with a flat file, the exact same kind of file. Just put it between your fingers like this and file across it until it's nice and flat, and put the box together until you get a really nice smooth turn when you turn the output shaft, so that it doesn't bind the bearings and there's no in and out play. And that's basically custom making the same thing we did when we were making them. There's some type of variance we believe is probably the gear, and we may actually include this in the kit so people can make them themselves if they have to. It's really not that hard to do, because you're not talking about taking very much material off at all until you get a real nice smooth box. We'll try to figure out what it is that's going to fix it permanently, but for now, that's the fix to it. As you're looking for the parts to complete step 4-3 of the manual, you will notice that this part right here is in the kit. It's actually both the tail blade grips, the bearings, and the 2x4mm cap screws that are screwed into the tail rotor hub. So all this stuff is located basically in one assembly. You will still need to locate the 2 control balls. You'll need to locate the 2x12mm shank screws. You'll need to locate the 2x7mm flathead screws. You'll need to locate the 3x3mm set screw and the 2 M2 lock nuts. To complete the assembly, we will be using a 1.5mm handled driver, a 0x0.5mm high quality Phillips screwdriver, a 4mm box end wrench, and blue Loctite on all the screws that are going into metal. These screws right here are going into the lock nuts, so they will not require any Loctite. I do suggest you take this assembly apart and check for Loctite on the ends of these screws. You never can tell, one of them may have got missed, and if this comes apart, it could definitely damage your model. Let's put this together and see what it looks like on the tail gearbox. After completing step 4-3 of the manual, if you've paid close attention to how all the parts went together, you'll notice that these bearings are on the outside of the blade grip. This will allow the blade grips to be able to move inward and outward, and it is normal for the design. We moved the 2 bearings to the outside so that they would take the thrust loading of the blade grip, because they're really too small to put thrust bearings in. So now you'll have 2 bearings taking the thrust loading, as opposed to just the one on the outside with the other bearing separated by aluminum. If you notice the in and out play and you're alarmed by it, just keep in mind it's normal. Once you put the assembly together, you will not have any of the in and out play. The ball links will hold it together. Once you get done, this is what you should basically have in your hand when you get completed. Make sure that when you put the ball links onto the balls, that everything moves nice and freely. If it doesn't, you can use a ball link reamer just like this one to ream out these ball links so that they're nice and smooth. This one is very smooth. I did have to ream it a little bit with the reamer to get it like this, but man, it's nice and smooth, and there's no slop in the links whatsoever. Actually, this tail is quite tight. There's absolutely no slop in anything. Just check to make sure that everything's tight. You've used proper amounts of Loctite on all the parts, and let's get on with the assembly.